I sold their entrance at 6:12 in the morning, and by 6:30 the entire HOA realized their million-dollar neighborhood had just become landlocked on paper. The sound hit first, a low metallic groan as the gate hinges gave way under a wrench I didn't even have to touch, followed by the steady hum of a diesel engine idling in the cool dawn air. The smell of cut steel and fresh gravel drifted across Whitaker Ridge like something old finally waking up. Denise Harrow's voice came next, sharp and polished, slicing through the morning like she owned it. "You can't do this," she snapped, heels crunching fast across the stone driveway that used to belong to my grandfather. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just held up the folded paper in my hand, still warm from the truck cab. "Already did," I said. "Closed yesterday." The sun hadn't fully cleared the hills yet, but it was enough to catch the edges of Silver Pines, rows of identical luxury homes sitting quiet behind that stone entrance they thought defined them. Clean lines, manicured lawns, imported trees that had never seen real dirt until someone planted them there. They built a whole world behind that gate. Problem was, they built it inside mine. My name's Caleb Whitaker. 43 years old. Third-generation owner of 2,300 acres of Texas land that most people drove past without realizing what it was. To them, it was just rolling hills and old fencing. To me, it was every summer I spent fixing barbed wire with my grandfather, every early morning hauling feed, every inch of soil that had my family's name written into it long before Silver Pines ever showed up on a brochure. The gravel under my boots that morning felt different. Heavier. Like it finally remembered who it belonged to. Denise stopped a few feet from me, her perfume cutting through the diesel fumes, expensive and sharp. She always smelled like control. Perfect hair, pressed blazer, that HOA president confidence that came from years of telling people what they could and couldn't do with their own property. "This is private community access," she said, slower now, like I was the one who didn't understand. "You're interfering with residential infrastructure." I let that hang there for a second. The distant chirp of birds. The idle engine. The faint clink of chain as the crew adjusted the gate hardware. "That road," I said, nodding toward the entrance behind her, runs straight through Parcel 17B. Her smile tightened, just for a second. Most people wouldn't have caught it. I did. Because I'd spent the last 2 weeks buried in county records, survey maps, and a rusted tin box my grandfather left behind. Turns out, Silver Pines had paperwork for everything: permits, zoning adjustments, landscaping approvals, but there was one thing they never actually owned. Not the gate. Not the road. Not the ground under either of them. What they had was access. Temporary. Conditional. And signed off decades ago when nobody thought a place like this would ever exist out here. Denise crossed her arms, trying to hold on to that same authority she walked in with. "We've been using this entrance for years," she said. "That establishes rights." I almost smiled. "Not the kind you think," I replied. Behind her, one of the contractors shut off the engine. Silence dropped over the entrance like a curtain. Clean. Final. I could feel it settle into the ground. For years, they fined people for mailbox colors, measured grass with rulers, told families what kind of fences they were allowed to build. All inside land they didn't actually control the way they thought they did. And the whole time, the one piece that held it all together was sitting right here. I looked past her, at the stone pillars with Silver Pines carved into them like permanence were something you could buy. Then I looked back at the paper in my hand. The ink hadn't even fully dried yet. "You should call your board," I said quietly. "Because as of this morning, you don't own your way in anymore." The first time I realized something was wrong, it was not the gate or the houses or even Denise's voice telling me I did not belong on my own land, it was the fence line that did not match the memory in my head. I had been gone almost a year, working a contract out in West Texas, long days under a sky so wide it made everything else feel small, and when I finally drove back up Whitaker Ridge, the tires of my truck crunching over gravel that sounded just a little too clean, I knew before I even stepped out that something had shifted. The air smelled different, less like dry grass and cedar and more like fresh irrigation and imported soil, like someone had tried to manufacture a version of nature they could control. My grandfather used to say land tells you when it is being messed with, you just have to listen long enough. I shut the engine off and let the silence settle, but it was not real silence anymore. There was a distant hum, steady and artificial, the kind that comes from pool pumps and underground lighting systems, things that do not belong on working land. I followed the old boundary markers the way he taught me, counting steps, watching the slope of the ground, looking for the bent cedar post that had marked the northeast corner since before I was born. It was gone. In its place stood a polished stone column with a bronze plaque bolted into it, letters carved deep and proud like they expected to last forever. Silver Pines. Established 2021. I remember running my hand over that cold metal, feeling the edge of each letter, and thinking how something that new could already feel so permanent to the people who built it. That was the moment it stopped feeling like a mistake and started feeling like a plan. I drove further in, past landscaping that had no business surviving a Texas summer without constant attention, past identical driveways and mailboxes lined up like they had been measured with a ruler, and every few yards I saw pieces of my land rewritten into something else. The old creek bed my grandfather used to talk about had been reshaped into a decorative water feature. The gentle slope where we once ran cattle now held a row of houses with stone facades and tinted windows that reflected the sky like they owned it. And then I saw the road. Smooth asphalt cutting clean through what used to be a dirt path we barely maintained, wide enough for 2 lanes, lined with lights and trimmed edges, leading straight to that entrance they were so proud of. The same entrance where I stood this morning holding a piece of paper that said otherwise. I remember the first time I tried to ask someone about it, a man watering his lawn with a hose that probably ran all day just to keep that shade of green. I told him my name, told him this was Whitaker land, and he looked at me like I had just stepped out of a different decade. He smiled polite, the kind of smile you give someone you think is confused, and said the developer handled all that years ago. Permits, approvals, everything by the book. I nodded like I believed him, but the words did not sit right. My grandfather did not sell pieces of this land. He protected it. Every acre. Every boundary. That night I dug through the old records, the ones most people would have thrown away, brittle paper, hand-drawn surveys, signatures that carried weight even decades later. The smell of dust and ink filled the room as I spread them across the table, and piece by piece the picture started to form. They did not buy this land. They built around it. And the one thing they needed to make it all work, the one strip that connected their perfect neighborhood to the outside world, was never theirs to begin with. I met Denise Harrow 3 days after I found the map, and she did not introduce herself like someone who needed permission to be anywhere. The sun was high that afternoon, baking the stone and asphalt until the air shimmered above the road, and I could smell that same artificial mix of treated water and fresh mulch drifting across what used to be open pasture. She rolled up in a white SUV that looked like it had never touched a dirt road in its life, tires clean, paint reflecting everything except the ground beneath it. When she stepped out, she did not look around like she was visiting, she looked straight at me like she had already decided what I was doing there. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice smooth, measured, the kind of tone people use when they are already in charge of the answer. I wiped my hands on my jeans, dust sticking to my palms, and told her my name. Told her this was Whitaker land. For a second, nothing changed. Then her expression shifted just enough to show she had heard that before. Not surprised. Not confused. Just prepared. "This community has been fully permitted and developed," she said, gesturing behind her like everything in sight proved her point. "If you have concerns, you will need to take them up with the board." The board. Not her. Even though everything about the way she stood there said she was the board. I glanced past her at the houses, at the way the driveways curved just right, at the landscaping that had been planned down to the inch, and I realized this was not something thrown together overnight. This was years of paperwork, signatures, approvals, people nodding in offices somewhere far away from this dirt. "Who owns the entrance?" I asked. Simple question. Direct. The kind my grandfather would have asked without thinking twice. Denise smiled then, small and tight, like I had just asked something irrelevant. The association manages all access points, she said. That is standard for private communities. Manages. Not owns. I caught that, even if she hoped I would not. The wind picked up just enough to carry the faint creak of the gate down the road, metal shifting against metal, and I felt something settle in my chest. I had spent the last few nights going over those records again and again, tracing lines on paper that had not changed in decades, and every time I came back to the same detail. That strip of land. That road. It was still mine. Denise took a step closer, heels pressing into gravel that did not belong to her no matter how polished it looked. You cannot just walk into a private development and make claims, she continued, her tone sharpening slightly, like she was used to ending conversations this way. We have security, we have legal counsel, and we have documentation for everything here. I nodded slowly, letting her finish. The sound of a lawn sprinkler clicked on somewhere behind us, spraying a perfect arc of water across grass that would never survive without it. That is good, I said. You should hold on to that documentation. She frowned, just a fraction, like she was trying to decide if I was being difficult or just out of my depth. I could see it in her eyes, that calculation people make when they are deciding how much attention you deserve. If you do not leave, she said, I will have to ask security to escort you off the property. There it was. The line she was used to crossing without resistance. I looked down the road again, at the entrance framed by those stone pillars, at the clean-cut edge where asphalt met dirt that had been there long before any of this. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the back of my head, steady and certain, telling me to let people talk until they show you exactly what they think they own. I turned back to her, meeting her eyes for the first time since she stepped out of that SUV. You can call whoever you want, I said, keeping my voice level. But before you do, you might want to double-check where your road actually sits. For the first time since she arrived, Denise did not respond right away. It was only a second, maybe less, but it was enough. Enough for me to know she understood exactly what I was talking about, even if she was not ready to admit it yet. And that was the moment I knew this was not going to be a conversation. It was going to be a fight built on paper, patience, and one piece of land she thought nobody would ever look at closely enough. The letter showed up 2 days later, folded clean and sealed like it carried authority just by existing, and I could smell the fresh ink before I even opened it, that sharp chemical scent that always means someone paid to make their words sound official. I stood on the tailgate of my truck with the sun beating down on the metal, heat rising through my boots, and read every line twice. Unauthorized access. Trespassing within a private residential development. Immediate compliance required. There was a fine attached too, printed bold like it was already owed, $18,700 for repeated violations of community boundaries. I let out a slow breath and looked up at the same road I had walked my entire life, only now it had a name that was not mine and rules that did not belong here. The hum of a passing golf cart echoed from somewhere deeper inside Silver Pines, followed by the soft click of garage doors opening. In sequence, like the whole place ran on a schedule that never questioned itself. They were not just asking me to leave. They were telling me the ground under my boots had changed ownership without ever touching a pen in my hand. I folded the letter carefully, slower than necessary, feeling the thickness of the paper between my fingers, and slid it back into the envelope. People like Denise did not rush. They layered pressure. Paper first. Then presence. Then consequences. That afternoon, I drove down to the entrance again, same stretch of asphalt cutting through land that still existed on every county map under my family name, and this time there was a uniformed guard sitting in a small white booth I had never seen before. The glass reflected the sky so clean it almost looked like a mirror, and when I pulled up, he stepped out with a clipboard already in hand, posture straight, eyes trained like he had been given very clear instructions. Sir, this is a restricted access community, he said, voice polite but firm, the kind of tone that comes from repeating the same sentence all day. I nodded toward the road behind him. I have been using this access longer than that booth has been here, I replied. He hesitated just long enough to show he was not sure how to respond to that, then glanced back toward the gate like it might answer for him. "I need to ask you to turn around," he said finally. "Residents only." Residents. Not owners. Not landholders. Just people inside the line Denise had drawn. I rested my arm on the window frame and let the engine idle, the steady vibration running through the steering wheel into my hands. "Who told you to stop me?" I asked. He did not answer right away. Instead, he tapped the clipboard lightly, like it held the authority he needed. "I have instructions from the association," he said. There it was again. The association. Not a person. Not a name. Something broad enough to hide behind. I glanced past him at the gate, at the hinges, the lock mechanism, the clean edge where new steel met old ground, and I felt that same quiet certainty settle in deeper. They were building layers now. Physical ones. Trying to make control look permanent. "You might want to keep a copy of whatever instructions they gave you," I said, keeping my voice even. "Because that road is not going to belong to them much longer." He frowned slightly, like he was trying to decide if I was serious or just another problem to report, but he did not argue. He just stepped back and waited. I shifted the truck into reverse, gravel crunching under the tires as I backed away from the gate, the sound louder than it should have been in the still afternoon air. As I turned around, I caught a glimpse of Denise standing further up the drive, arms crossed, watching the whole exchange like she had already decided how it would end. But she did not wave. She did not speak. She just stood there, confident in a system she believed she controlled. And as I drove back up the ridge, the envelope sitting on the seat beside me, I realized something important. They had moved from words to enforcement. Which meant they were worried. And when people like Denise start tightening their grip, it is usually because they know something underneath it is starting to slip. By the end of that week, the paper started stacking up faster than the dust on my boots, each envelope heavier than the last, each one carrying the same polished tone that tried to turn assumption into authority. I laid them out across the old wooden table in my grandfather's workshop, the same table where he used to spread feed invoices and hand-drawn maps, and for a second the contrast hit me harder than anything Denise had said. His papers were worn, edges soft, ink faded but certain. These were crisp, machine-printed, every word calculated. Violation notices. Escalated fines. Formal warnings about legal action. The total climbed past $20,000 in less than 10 days, numbers printed in bold like repetition alone could make them real. The air inside the workshop smelled like old pine and oil, steady and familiar, but every time I picked up one of those letters I caught that sharp scent of fresh toner again, like it did not belong in the same space. I sat there longer than I should have, elbows resting on the table, fingers pressed against my temples, listening to the quiet hum of the overhead light and the distant wind moving through the trees outside. For the first time since I found that map, I understood what they were trying to do. Not prove ownership. Not argue facts. Just apply pressure until it became easier to step back than to keep standing there. The next morning I drove into town, the same courthouse my grandfather used to take me to when I was a kid, back when it felt like a place where things made sense if you asked the right questions. The building had not changed much, same stone steps, same heavy doors, but inside everything felt slower, like it moved on a different clock than the one Denise operated on. I waited in line with a folder under my arm, listening to the low murmur of conversations, the occasional shuffle of papers, the soft click of keyboards behind the counter. When it was my turn, I slid the survey maps and deed copies across to the clerk, an older man with reading glasses perched low on his nose, and watched as he adjusted them slightly, lining up the edges before he even started reading. That told me something. People who respect paper treat it carefully. He took his time, eyes moving slowly across the lines, tracing boundaries that had been drawn long before Silver Pines ever existed. "You said there is an issue with access," he asked without looking up. I nodded. "They are claiming control over the entrance," I said. "Posting security. Issuing fines." He let out a quiet breath, almost like he had seen this kind of situation before, then leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "These developments," he said, choosing his words carefully, "they usually come with layers of agreements. Easements, usage rights, sometimes temporary licenses depending on how the land was originally structured." Temporary. There it was again. The same word that kept showing up in the documents I had been reading. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice even though there was no one close enough to hear. "What happens if that access is not permanent?" I asked. He looked up then, really looked at me for the first time, like he was deciding how much to say. "The fluorescent lights above us hummed softly, filling the space between us. Then whoever holds title to that strip," he said slowly, "has more leverage than most people realize." Leverage. Not ownership. Not control. Just enough to shift everything if you knew how to use it. I thanked him, gathered the papers, and stepped back out into the sunlight, the heat hitting my face like a reminder that nothing had actually changed yet. But something inside me had. As I walked back to my truck, I could feel the weight of those letters differently now, not as pressure, but as proof. They were pushing hard because they needed that road to stay exactly where it was, exactly how it was. And for the first time since Denise told me to leave my own land, I stopped thinking about how to argue with them and started thinking about what would happen if I did not argue at all, if I just used the one thing they built everything around and moved it out from under them. That night I did not open another letter, I did not call a lawyer, and I did not step foot anywhere near that gate, because for the first time since this started I understood something simple and dangerous at the same time. I did not need to fight Denise on her ground if I could move the ground itself. The workshop was quiet except for the faint ticking of cooling metal from the day's heat, and the old overhead fan pushed slow circles of warm air that smelled like dust, oil, and paper that had outlived the people who wrote it. I pulled the tin box back onto the table and opened it again, careful this time, like I was handling something that had been waiting for me to finally pay attention. Inside were the same brittle maps, folded along lines that had been pressed decades ago, edges cracked but still holding, and beneath them the original transfer documents my grandfather signed when he divided operational sections of the land but never gave up control of access. I flattened one of the surveys under my palm, tracing the boundary with my finger, following the line until it narrowed into that strip. 30 feet wide in some places, 40 in others, running just under a mile before connecting to the county road. It did not look like much on paper. Just a thin line between blocks of shaded acreage. But everything Silver Pines depended on passed through it. Every car. Every delivery. Every piece of infrastructure that made that place feel like a self-contained world. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a second, letting the quiet settle, and I could almost hear my grandfather's voice again, not saying anything complicated, just reminding me that land does not argue, it holds. The next morning I made a different kind of drive, not toward the gate, not toward Denise, but into town again, this time to a low brick office building that most people would not notice unless they needed something very specific. The sign out front read Whitaker Agricultural Logistics, faded just enough to show it had been there a while, and when I stepped inside the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of coffee and printer ink that had nothing to prove. Mark Ellison was already behind his desk when I walked in, sleeves rolled up, pen moving across a stack of documents with the kind of steady focus that comes from years of dealing with contracts that actually matter. He looked up when the door clicked shut, took one glance at my face, and leaned back slightly like he already knew this was not a casual visit. "You look like you found something," he said, setting the pen down. I did not sit right away. I pulled the folded survey from under my arm and laid it on his desk, smoothing it out so the line was clear. "I did not lose the land," I said. "They built around it." Mark leaned forward, eyes scanning the map, and I watched the moment it clicked for him, the same way it had for me, quiet but definite. His fingers tapped once against the paper, right where that narrow strip cut through the entrance. "They are using this?" he asked. I nodded. "They built their entire access on it," I said. "And they are acting like they own it." He let out a low breath, not surprised, just measuring what that meant. Outside, a truck rolled past, the distant rumble vibrating faintly through the floor, and for a second everything felt connected in a way it had not before. Roads. Access. movement, control. So what are you thinking? Mark asked, leaning back again, arms crossing loosely like he was already running through options. I did not hesitate this time. I am thinking I stop arguing, I said. And I let the land do the talking. He studied me for a second longer, then nodded once, slow and certain. Then you do not sell the whole property, he said. You sell the piece they cannot live without. The word settled into the room like they had weight, heavier than any letter Denise had sent, heavier than any fine printed in bold. I looked down at the map again, at that narrow strip that had been there long before anyone thought to build gates and fences and rules around it, and for the first time since this started, I could see the end of it clearly. Not a fight. Not a courtroom. Just a signature in the right place, on the right piece of paper, turning everything they thought was permanent into something temporary overnight. The paperwork moved faster than anything Denise had thrown at me, and that was the part she never saw coming, because people like her expect resistance, arguments, delays, not silence and signatures happening somewhere they are not watching. 3 days after I sat in Mark's office, we were back at that same desk, but this time the map was not just a discovery, it was a plan laid out in clean lines and legal language that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. The air inside felt cooler than before, steady, controlled, the kind of place where decisions get made without noise. Mark slid the draft agreement across the desk, pages stacked neat, every clause precise, every boundary described down to the inch. I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper, feeling that same weight I felt in my grandfather's documents, not in age, but in certainty. This was not a threat. It was a transfer. Whitaker Agricultural Logistics would acquire full title to the entrance strip, including the roadway, the gate structure, and all access control rights tied to that land. Not the houses. Not the HOA. Just the one piece everything else depended on. Once this is recorded, Mark said, tapping the final page lightly, they cannot claim management without your permission, and they cannot operate that entrance without ours. Ours. The word settled differently now. I nodded once and picked up the pen. It felt heavier than it should have, or maybe I just understood what it meant this time. The ink flowed clean as I signed my name, no hesitation, no second guessing, just a straight line connecting everything that had led up to this moment. The sound of the pen against paper was quiet, almost lost in the room, but it carried more weight than every letter Denise had sent combined. When it was done, Mark gathered the pages, clipped them together, and stood. We file this today, he said. County records will reflect the change by morning. By morning. I stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, the heat pressing down on the pavement, and for a second everything looked the same as it had all week. Cars moving in the distance. Wind brushing through the trees. Nothing on the surface had shifted yet. But underneath it, the ground had already changed hands. That evening, I did not drive back to the gate. I stayed up on the ridge, watching the lights of silver pines come on one by one as the sun dropped behind the hills, each house glowing soft and steady like it was part of something permanent. From a distance, it looked peaceful. Complete. Like nothing could interrupt it. I leaned against the fence line that had been here longer than any of those homes, the wood rough under my hand, and listened to the quiet settle over the land again. No engines. No voices. Just wind and distance and the faint hum of a place that did not yet know it had a problem. Somewhere down below, that gate still stood, metal locked, security posted, rules enforced like they always had been. But the difference now was simple. It did not belong to them anymore. And they would not find that out from me walking up and telling them. They would find out the only way that matters. When they tried to use it. The first sign was not the gate opening, it was the line of cars that did not move. I was already awake before sunrise, standing on the ridge with a cup of coffee gone cold in my hand, watching the entrance from a distance the way you watch something you already understand but want to see unfold anyway. The air was still, carrying that faint early morning chill that never lasts long in Texas, and down below the headlights started to gather, one after another, like they always did at the same hour. Commuters, school runs, routines built on predictability. Engines idling. brake lights glowing red in a slow line that should have been moving forward. But it was not. I could not hear the voices from that far out, but I could see the hesitation, the way drivers leaned forward slightly in their seats, the way doors opened one at a time as people stepped out, trying to understand why the gate was not responding the way it always had. The metal arm stayed still. No smooth swing inward. No automatic clearance. Just a locked mechanism sitting on land that had a different name attached to it now. About 10 minutes in, a service truck pulled up behind the line, white paint, company logo stamped on the side, the kind of vehicle that gets waved through without question. The driver stepped out, keys in hand, and walked up to the control panel like he had done 100 times before. He pressed something. Waited. Pressed it again. Nothing. I could almost feel the moment it hit him, not panic, just confusion turning into something heavier. He reached for his phone. That was when Denise's SUV appeared, cutting through the shoulder like she had somewhere more important to be than everyone else. She stepped out fast this time, no slow approach, no measured posture, just urgency wrapped in control she was trying to keep from slipping. Even from the distance I could tell she was talking, directing, pointing at the gate, at the panel, at the road like the answer was somewhere in plain sight if she just pushed hard enough. A few minutes later, another truck rolled in, this one from Mark's company, clean, deliberate, no rush in the way it moved. Two men stepped out, both wearing the same neutral expression of people who know exactly why they are there. One of them walked straight to the base of the gate and knelt down, pulling a folder from his bag. Papers. Always paper. Denise moved toward him, faster now, and even without hearing a word I could see the shift in her posture when he handed her the document. She took it, scanned the first page, then the second, her shoulders tightening just slightly as the meaning settled in. Ownership transfer. Recorded. Effective immediately. The same language I had signed my name under less than 24 hours ago. The man did not argue with her. He did not raise his voice. He just pointed once toward the property line marked on the diagram and then toward the gate itself. That was all it took. Behind them, the line of cars had grown longer, engines humming, people stepping out, checking phones, looking around for someone to fix a problem that was not mechanical anymore. It was structural. The gate was not broken. It was simply no longer theirs to operate. I took a slow breath and let it out, the cool air cutting clean through the heat that was already starting to build with the rising sun. Down there, everything Silver Pines depended on had just met the one thing it could not override. Not money. Not rules. Not influence. Just a line on a map that had always been there, waiting for someone to draw attention to it at the right time. And for the first time since Denise told me to leave my own land, I watched her stand in front of that entrance with nothing left to enforce except the reality she had tried to ignore. By mid-morning, the line of cars had turned into something else entirely, not just an inconvenience but a realization spreading one driver at a time that the rules they trusted did not apply anymore, and from where I stood I could see it ripple through the neighborhood like a slow wave. People were no longer just waiting, they were talking, pointing, pulling out phones, calling someone who was supposed to have answers, and every minute that passed without the gate opening made the silence behind those answers louder. Denise stayed near the entrance longer than anyone else, her posture rigid, shoulders squared like she could hold control in place if she refused to step away from it, but control is not something you can stand in front of once it is gone. Around noon, the second notice went up, this one posted clean on the side of the gate where everyone could see it, white paper against dark metal, the same language Mark had shown me, clear and final. Private agricultural access. Authorized use only. Contact listed below. No mention of Silver Pines. No acknowledgement of the association that had spent years acting like it owned that space. Just a boundary, defined in a way that did not leave room for interpretation. I drove down later that afternoon, not in a hurry, just following the same road I had always used, gravel giving way to asphalt and then back again, the transition sharp in a way it had not been before. The guard booth was still there, but it felt smaller now, less certain, like it had been built for a system that no longer existed. The man inside recognized me immediately, his posture different this time, not rigid, not rehearsed, just uncertain. He stepped out as I pulled up, glancing once at the notice, then back at me. "They told us to redirect all questions," he said, voice quieter than before. I nodded, reaching over to the passenger seat where a fresh envelope sat, heavier than the ones Denise had sent me, because this one carried terms, not threats. "That is a good idea," I said, handing it to him. "Make sure she gets this." He took it carefully, like he understood it mattered, and for a second neither of us said anything else. The gate stood behind him, unchanged in structure but completely different in meaning, a piece of metal anchored to land that had finally been acknowledged for what it was. As I drove past, I could see small groups of residents gathered near the entrance, conversations low but intense, the kind of discussions that happen when people realize something fundamental has shifted under them without warning. Later that evening, Denise came up the ridge. I heard her vehicle before I saw it, tires pressing harder into the gravel than necessary, engine cutting off with a final note that hung in the air a little longer than usual. She stepped out slower this time, no rush, no performance, just someone carrying the weight of a situation that had moved beyond her reach. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through the trees, carrying the faint scent of dust and sun-warmed earth. The same smell I grew up with, unchanged by everything that had happened below. She stopped a few feet away, holding the envelope I had sent, already opened, the papers inside creased from being read more than once. "You could have talked to us," she said, her voice steady but missing the edge it used to carry. I looked out over the land, past her, past the road, past the houses that now felt like they were sitting inside something they did not fully understand. "I tried," I replied. "You told me to leave." She did not answer that. Instead, she glanced back toward the entrance, then down at the papers again, like she was still hoping there was a version of this that worked in her favor. "What do you want?" she asked finally. It was a simple question, but it sounded different coming from her now. Not a demand. Not an assumption. Just a question. I took a slow breath, letting the quiet settle between us, and then answered the only way that made sense.